She arrived in Toronto ranked so far outside the spotlight that almost nobody outside her home country bothered to write her name into their bracket predictions. And she leaves this tournament as the player every seed in the draw is suddenly terrified to see across the net. Because in the space of one unforgettable week, she didn't just win matches, she took down an Olympic champion in straight sets, stitched together 7 wins in a row across 2 different tournaments, and punched her way into the quarterfinals of a WTA 1000 event for the very first time in her career. And by the time the final ball landed on that Wednesday night, the entire city of Toronto felt less like a tennis venue and more like a corner of Manila that had somehow been airlifted across the Pacific. Let's rewind though, because to understand just how enormous this moment was for Alex, you have to understand what she walked through to get there, and it wasn't pretty. Her ankle was wrecked. The tape that had been wound around it during a brutal 2-hour and 39-minute battle against Katie McNally had to be ripped off mid-match out of sheer desperation. The kind of moment where a player has to decide in real time whether pushing through pain is worth the risk of something much worse, and Alex decided it was. She survived that war. She extended what was already the longest winning streak of her career to 7 matches. And she found herself back in the 4th round of a WTA 1000 tournament for the first time since her breakout run in Miami back in 2025. A run that first put her name on the radar of casual tennis fans everywhere. And she did every bit of that while nursing an injury that would have ended the tournament for plenty of players with far more experience than her. So when the draw revealed her next opponent, the tennis world took notice. Because waiting for her in the round of 16 was Belinda Bencic, the Swiss veteran seated 12th in Toronto, a former world number 4 who had just come through a war of her own. A 3-hour and 24-minute slugfest against American Taylor Townsend that Bencic somehow escaped by the narrowest of margins. This wasn't just a step up in competition. This was a genuine crossroads match, the kind that either confirms a rising star is the real deal or exposes her as a player who simply caught fire for a week. On one side of the net stood a 29-year-old who had already won this exact tournament a decade earlier, back in 2015. A player who had reached the semifinals of 2 separate Grand Slams and who carried an Olympic gold medal in her trophy case. On the other side stood a 21-year-old from Manila who had never faced anyone with a resume like that before, not in a match this big, not with this much on the line. And here's the thing about Bencic's resume that makes this matchup so fascinating. She isn't just decorated, she's genuinely one of the most complete players to have picked up a racket in the last decade. 9 WTA titles, a career high ranking of world number 4, semi-final runs at the US Open in 2019 and at Wimbledon as recently as last year. And then there's Tokyo. Back in 2021, Bencic became the first Swiss woman in history to stand atop an Olympic podium in tennis, defeating Marketa Vondrousova in a tense 3-set final to claim gold. And if that wasn't enough, she paired with Victoria Golubic to add a silver medal in doubles during the very same games, turning what was already a career-defining moment into something close to legendary status back home. She later spoke about how personal that victory felt, describing the emotional weight of dedicating the win to 2 of her mentors, Roger Federer and Martina Hingis, both towering figures in Swiss tennis history who, despite their own extraordinary careers, had never managed to win an Olympic singles gold themselves. So when people talk about Belinda Bencic, they aren't talking about some journeywoman who got hot for a fortnight. They're talking about a proven, battle-hardened competitor with the scar tissue and the trophies to match. Now, you'd think facing someone with that kind of pedigree would be intimidating for a 21-year-old playing through an ankle injury, and maybe for some players it would have been. But Alex had already been quietly building her own case for greatness, even if the wider tennis world hadn't fully clocked it yet. Heading into this tournament, she carried a startling 9-4 record against top 10 opponents. And 7 of those 9 victories had come in this calendar year alone. A statistic that doesn't just suggest she can compete with elite players. It suggests she's built specifically to beat them. She had already knocked off Olympic medalists before. She had already beaten Grand Slam champions before. She had even taken down a former world number 3. This wasn't unfamiliar territory for her, even if the stage kept getting bigger every time. And when it comes to fuel, she had more of it in Toronto than almost any player could ask for. Because more than 10,000 fans were about to pack into Sobeys Stadium, a huge share of them draped in Philippine flags, ready to turn a WTA quarterfinal into something that felt closer to a home game. So that was the build-up heading into 4th round night, an Olympic champion who had just survived a marathon against Townsend on one side of the net, and a rising Filipina star who had just survived her own war against McNally on the other. Two players riding winning streaks, two players who had never shared a court before, and an entire arena waiting to see which story would win out. And when the first point was struck, it became immediately clear that Alex hadn't traveled all this way just to make up the numbers. She had come to make a statement. Bencic came out aggressive, exactly the way you'd expect from someone with her experience and her instincts. Someone who has spent over a decade learning exactly how to seize control of points against younger, less seasoned opponents. She tried to dictate the terms early, using her variety and her movement to pull Alex out of rhythm the same way she had worn down Townsend just one round earlier. But Alex had an answer for every single question Bencic asked her. Instead of trying to match power with power or trade haymakers with a player who had built an entire career on absorbing pressure and redirecting it, Alex settled into a rhythm of relentless consistency. She refused to let Bencic dictate. When Bencic tried to take control of rallies and shorten points the way she had against Townsend, Alex extended them instead, forcing errors, making her opponent play one more shot than she wanted to, waiting patiently for the moment to strike rather than chasing it recklessly. Afterwards, she'd explain her mindset in the simplest possible terms, saying she just had to take the match point by point, and honestly, watching how she executed that plan, you'd believe every word of it. What made the performance even more remarkable is that her movement never betrayed the ankle concerns that had followed her out of the McNally match. There was no hesitation, no obvious guarding, no sign that she was playing anything less than 100%, and by the time the numbers were tallied, it was clear this wasn't a close match dressed up as a big upset. This was a genuine dismantling. A Filipina sensation had just taken apart an Olympic gold medalist in straight sets, and she'd done it on one of the biggest stages of the tournament. The context only made the achievement more impressive because Bencic wasn't some tired afterthought stumbling into an early exit. She had just survived a 3-hour marathon against Townsend, saving match points along the way, battle-tested and sharpened by adversity. And Alex still had an answer for everything that Bencic threw at her. When the final point landed, she dropped her racket and threw her arms up, and it was worth remembering in that moment exactly what she had just done. This wasn't a case of settling a score or avenging a previous defeat. She had simply gone out and beaten the best player standing in front of her. Which, if you think about it, might be the most dangerous kind of victory a young player can produce, because it tells every other player left in the draw that there's nowhere left to hide. The stadium noise afterward was something else entirely. Filipino flags waved from every corner of the arena, and Alex booked her place in the quarterfinals of a WTA 1000 tournament for the very first time in her career. For her, this wasn't just another win to add to the streak. It was proof, hard evidence, that this 7-match run wasn't some fluke or hot streak destined to cool off the moment she faced real quality. She had gone through an Olympic champion, extended the best run of her career, and quieted anyone still wondering whether she truly belonged among the sport's elite. But there wasn't much time to celebrate because waiting in the quarterfinals was a name every tennis fan would recognize immediately, and we'll get to that. First, though, let's talk about what made this night in Toronto feel like something bigger than sport. Because if you thought the second round performance had already introduced the wider tennis world to what people were starting to call a mania, the 4th round proved that idea was still just getting started. When Alex walked out onto center court at Sobeys Stadium to face Bencic, the atmosphere inside that arena was unlike anything the Canadian Open had ever produced. More than 10,000 fans crammed into the stands, and Philippine flags were draped over railings, over boxes, over the upper deck, turning the whole venue into a wash of blue, red, and yellow. Chants of her name rolled through the stadium with a force that honestly sounded closer to a World Cup atmosphere than anything you'd typically associate with a professional tennis match. One traveling journalist who has followed her rise from the very beginning described it as the loudest Filipino crowd she had ever witnessed, saying it genuinely felt like being back home rather than sitting inside a stadium in Canada. And when you consider that the greater Toronto area is home to a Filipino community numbering well over 270,000 people according to the most recent census, that reaction starts to make a lot more sense because for so many of those fans, This wasn't just a tennis match to attend after work. It was a chance to celebrate identity, heritage, and representation all at once. A community showing up in force to support one of their own on a stage that rarely, if ever, gets built for Filipino athletes. One local community leader, someone deeply involved in organizing Filipino cultural events across the city, told reporters that Alex was starting to be branded as the next Manny Pacquiao, explaining that her youth and the sheer wave of attention surrounding her had given her a kind of magnetic charm within the community, one that inspires genuine organic support rather than the manufactured kind. And honestly, when you put it in context against some of the most electric nights in recent Canadian tennis history, this comparison starts to feel earned rather than exaggerated. Think about Victoria Mboko's run to a title on home soil in Montreal, or Bianca Andreescu's stunning championship breakthrough back in 2019, or Denis Shapovalov's shocking upset over Rafael Nadal in 2017. All of those moments are etched into Canadian tennis folklore, but every single one of them involved a Canadian player delivering for a Canadian crowd. What happened on this particular Wednesday night in Toronto was something different entirely. A full-throated, citywide celebration of multiculturalism, with a massive community turning out to support what might be the biggest Filipino sports star to emerge since Pacquiao himself first captured the world's attention. Inside the venue, you could see just how personal it had become for people. Groups of young men wore matching t-shirts with the words "Fight, Believe, Represent" stitched across the front. A couple sitting with their young child held up a handwritten sign reading "Past my bedtime but cheering for you." Alex, a small detail that somehow captured the emotional stakes of the night better than any highlight reel could. Somewhere in the crowd, a man wearing a Blue Jays cap posed for photos while holding both Canadian and Filipino flags side by side in front of a giant inflatable tennis ball. A perfect little snapshot of dual identity on full display. Signs referencing Emania were everywhere, along with messages written in Filipino calling for love and support. It was, in every sense, a testament to the raw power of representation, the kind of scene that reminds you why sports can matter so much beyond the scoreline. So when the match finally ended, when Alex had dismantled an Olympic gold medalist in straight sets in front of that roaring crowd, the eruption inside the stadium was deafening, loud enough that you could reasonably believe the noise carried all the way across York University's sprawling campus on the northern edge of the city. Alex soaked it all in, forming a heart shape with her hands as a tribute to the crowd that had carried her through every step of that match. A gesture that instantly became one of the defining images of the tournament. One broadcaster covering the match for the WTA's international feed captured the scene perfectly in real time, remarking that the noise pouring out of that stadium sounded like something you'd expect after a Grand Slam final, not a fourth-round match in Toronto, and adding that Alex was doing things in this sport that genuinely felt out of this world. When she addressed the crowd afterward, she spoke about feeling completely at home in a city she'd never called home before, describing how the Filipino community there had embraced her almost like extended family. She thanked them for carrying her through the toughest stretches of her career, and she made a promise to keep fighting, to keep believing, and to keep representing. 3 words that the crowd would carry with them long after they filed out of the stadium that night. The people stayed on their feet. The chants continued. The flags kept waving. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, a quarterfinal dream that had once felt almost impossible for a 25 seed suddenly felt very, very real. Let's step back for a second and put the scale of this achievement into proper context, because it's easy to get swept up in the emotion of the crowd and forget just how remarkable the tennis itself actually was. This victory over Bencic pushed her winning streak to 8 matches, officially the longest of her career, and made her the first Filipino player in history to reach the quarterfinals of a WTA 1000 event, a tier of tournament just below the Grand Slams in terms of prestige and ranking points. Along the way to that milestone, she had beaten an Olympic gold medalist, a former world number 4, and a player who had literally won this exact tournament a decade earlier. When you stack Bencic's resume up against that result, 2 Grand Slam semifinal appearances, an Olympic gold medal from Tokyo, and 9 career WTA titles, the scale of the upset becomes almost hard to fully process. And this wasn't a lucky bounce or an off night for a tired veteran either. This was a 21-year-old systematically solving one of the most experienced and well-rounded players on tour. Her path through this tournament had been nothing short of a tightrope walk in resilience from the very first match. She opened her campaign with a gritty 3-set win over Alicia Parks, A result that carried extra emotional weight because it avenged a previous loss to Parks at the Australian Open earlier in the year. And she played that opening match in front of a sold-out crowd that had clearly already started to sense something special was brewing. She described feeling an enormous surge of adrenaline after that win, saying the excitement didn't fade even hours later while she was working out in the gym, adding that the victory meant a great deal to her both as an opportunity to learn and as a chance to keep growing as a competitor. Then came the McNally match, a genuine survival test against an opponent who had just stunned reigning Wimbledon champion Jelena Ostapenko in the previous round. Alex battled through that nagging ankle issue for 2 hours and 39 minutes. Eventually prevailing in 3 tight sets after needing a medical timeout in the second set following an awkward roll of the ankle. She later admitted that in the moment everything happened so fast that she genuinely wasn't sure what had gone wrong, but she was relieved to find out afterward that there was no serious damage. And now, after conquering an Olympic champion in the 4th round, a new and painfully familiar name awaited her in the quarterfinals: Coco Gauff, the tournament's 4th seed, who had been watching this entire run unfold with obvious interest. Gauff had already weighed in publicly on the phenomenon surrounding Alex, saying that the new demographic of fans being drawn into tennis because of her deserved to be embraced, because ultimately everyone in the sport stands to benefit from that kind of growth and attention. That's a pretty remarkable thing for one of the biggest stars in the sport to say about a rising 25 seed. And it tells you just how far this story has already traveled beyond the borders of the Philippines. So where does this leave things? At this point, the question of whether Alex can genuinely compete with the best players in the world feels almost outdated, because she has already answered it emphatically, multiple times against multiple ranked opponents, under multiple different kinds of pressure. The real question now is simply how far this run can carry her. Toronto might just be the opening chapter. The Cincinnati Open looms right around the corner, and beyond that sits the US Open, one of the most demanding stages in all of tennis. And if this stretch has proven anything, it's that a 21-year-old from Manila is only just getting started. Picture it for a second: a young woman who grew up far from the traditional tennis pipelines of Europe and North America, fresh off arguably the biggest victory of her young career. Now walking into new arenas, in front of new sold-out crowds, representing not just herself, but an entire nation of more than 100 million people, along with a global diaspora that spans continents. What happens when that kind of weight meets that kind of talent under an even brighter spotlight? Nobody can say for certain yet, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes this story so compelling to follow. But if the events in Toronto revealed anything at all, it's that betting against her right now would be a mistake. Because every time the stage has gotten bigger, she has somehow found a way to rise to meet it, ankle injuries and all. She reached the quarterfinals of a WTA 1000 tournament for the first time in her life. She extended her winning streak to 8 straight matches. She beat an Olympic gold medalist in straight sets in front of more than 10,000 roaring fans, most of them there specifically for her. And through it all, the momentum behind her story shows absolutely no signs of slowing down anytime soon.